2. Introduction. Cognition, acquisition and use of knowledge. Cognition can be conceived of as the process by which sensory information can be used, stored, reduced, elaborated, transformed and recovered for its application to daily life activities. It encompasses the course of how information is acquired and way it is used, hence acquisition and application appear to be at the nucleus. Thus the implicit processes of sensation, attention, perception, thinking, learning, memory constitute the cognitive capacity of an individual. Knowledge about the world resulting from such processes further leads to the affective component of how does one feel about the world. Both the cognitive and the affective components in alliance then generate behavior. With this premise, field of cognitive psychology stands in close opposition to the behaviorist school. It asserts that rather than the observable behavior to be studied, the internal mental states giving rise to such behavior should be deeply investigated as the subject matter of psychology. The cognitive era can be dated back to 15th century, limited to the idea of thinking and awareness. The prominence began with recognizing association of mental faculties and affective experiences. The existing influences of various schools of thought made way for the new wave of cognitive revolution. Structuralism aiming to break down the conscious experience into basic elements through introspection techniques. Associationism attempting to explore how ideas get associated in mind based on similarity, dissimilarity and proximity in time. Functionalism, on the other hand, exploring the functions of mind, natural selection and its survival value. Followed by well-critiqued Freudian psychoanalysis, role of unconscious in construction of thought and behavior. Gestalist emphasizing on the laws of perception and objects to be perceived in totality where whole is greater than sum of its parts. Sweeping over with mind to be as the content of psychology, behaviorism emerged with exclusive focus on observable behavior being the only relevant subject matter of psychology. Overthrowing the dominant influence of behaviorism and logical positivism till 1960s, a twirl again to the study of mind began. This drift was so dramatic that it was often referred to as cognitive revolution with its prime focus on the mental processes. The term, cognitive psychology, was first propounded by American psychologist Ulrich Neisser in his book Cognitive Psychology 1965. It was thus conceived as branch of psychology that dealt with cognition or higher mental functions. The basic premise revolved around how humans process information, the mediating internal processes between stimulus acquisition, input and response output. As a part of the larger domain of cognitive science, cognitive psychology establishes strong interdisciplinarity with other fields such as neuroscience, artificial intelligence, linguistics, etc. Psychology paper number 1 Cognitive Science. Fig 1. Interdisciplinary relationship of cognitive psychology with other relevant fields. 3. Cognitive bias. A cognitive bias. A cognitive bias is a pattern of deviation in judgment that occurs in particular situations. Implicit in this concept of deviation is a standard of comparison. This may be the judgment of people outside those particular situations, or may be a set of independently verifiable facts. They appear to be replicable errors in human reasoning leading to consistent skewed judgment. The presence. Psychology. Higher mental functions: attention, perception, problem-solving, psycholinguistics, transformational grammar. Cognitive neuroscience: brain lesion and impact on cognition. Computer analogy: artificial intelligence, computer simulation. Psychology paper number 1 Cognitive Science. Of such biases has been verified empirically in the field of psychology, and its widespread influence is also viewed in other disciplines as well. Certain biases are presumably adaptive as they lead to facilitation of the decision-making process. Many of the others result from limitations of information processing abilities, mental confusion or merely social influence. Such judgment errors are viewed to completely distort and produce systematic errors in decision-making process. As a victim of such biases, the decision-maker sweeps from the optimal decisions and depreciates the utilization index. It is inferred as a person's tendency to make errors in judgment based on cognitive factors, and is a phenomenon studied in cognitive science and social psychology. Forms of cognitive bias include errors in social perception and attribution, selective attention, decision-making, etc. Such cognitive tilts immensely challenge the reliability of lawful support. The mental errors resulting from simplified information processing strategies should be differentiated from other biases that are embodied in the culture, organization, politics or the self of the individual. Thus cognitive tilts are then not a byproduct of any emotional or motivational vulnerabilities but rather mental predispositions. It more or less resembles an optical illusion, where the awareness of the illusion also does not reduce the strength and probability of bias. Various psychological efforts are in the area of assessing such biases in the laboratory as well as the natural settings. The assessment of such biases reveals relative rather than absolute nature of judgment aberrations. It connotes that in a group essentially all the members will not exhibit biased judgment but rather most of the judgments would be by and large affected by the predominating biases in the group. It thus gives more weight to temporal stability than internal inconsistency. Such biases are believed to be buttressed on mental shortcuts such as heuristics, algorithms or rules of thumb. 3.1 Causes of cognitive biases. Researchers in the field of cognition have attempted to understand the nature and causes of cognitive biases. Considering the debilitating effects of information processing tilts, it becomes imperative to delve into the origin or causes of such biases. Taversky and Kahneman 1974 reveal that biases may emerge from 3 basic heuristics such as representativeness, availability and adjustment and anchoring. Besides these, other potential reasons are also delineated. 3.1.1 Representativeness. The tendency of an individual to discern on events which seem to be representatives of the parent population and depict similar characteristics. The overestimated likelihood of events based on their greater representativeness leads to various judgment biases. Generally considered as a heuristic, it emerges from insensitivity to sample, configuration and also underestimation of prior probabilities. 3.1.2 Availability heuristic. It refers to the ease with which illustrations of particular mental phenomena emerge in the mind. As an example, if people are asked whether R as an alphabet appears more in beginning of the word or as the third letter, the most common response favors words beginning with R, whereas in reality, the number of words with R as third letter is more than words initiated with R. Such response emerges with effortless working of the mind. The recall is completely facilitated with easy availability of the mental content, which further seriously affects estimates of risk. Psychology paper number 1 Cognitive Science. 3.1.3 Anchoring or adjustment, another cause of cognitive biases is the tendency of an individual to rely heavily on a particular piece of information while drawing conclusions. The act selectively abstracting or just anchoring to some traits and further adjusting the evidences to conform with the plausible anchor emerges as the cause of cognitive tilts. The decision-making process undergoes serious contamination effects as a result of implicit adjustment to erroneous anchors. 3.1.4 Cognitive economy. Many of the cognitive biases emerge from limitations in information processing. Shortcuts used to evaluate probabilities such as availability or representativeness lead to judgmental errors. In various cases, deviation in judgment occurs as a result of deficits in actual processing of information. The tendency of the individual to economize cognitive efforts in terms of time and effort may result in skewed probabilities. 3.1.5 Cognitive traffic. Another potential reason for cognitive biases is the cognitive traffic or mental noise. It refers to the cognitive mess which may cause aberration in information processing. Such cognitive confusion may be due to the load of multitasking and processing, as a result of which the individual may resort to cognitive economy and not be able to adequately process all the available information. It could thus appear as mental traffic and lead to various psychological and social biases. 3.1.6 Social influence. Social dynamics well influence the cognitive process. Being a part of the group, various pressures such as groupthink, conformity, compliance operate on the members. The conformity to such pulls and pushes may lead to development of an rigid ideology which perhaps may act as an anchor, and all the decisions perhaps be adjusted to the anchor. For instance, with groupthink all the members may be drifted towards the same cliché perspective and emerge with hazardous decisions. Cognitive biases thus emerging from social influences may times become chronic and almost act as affliction to the group. 3.1.7 Prior hypotheses. In various cases it has also been observed that people may have their prior hypotheses about relation between certain variables. March and Chypra, 1987. This may lead to selective attention towards the available information and ignorance of other worthwhile information. The focus on limited targets and perceived expectancies may result in skewed perception of the environment and problem at hand. 3.1.8 Estimate of outcome probability. Great body of literature reveals that estimates of outcome probabilities are generally ignored as a part of decision-making process. Kunruther, 1976, Slavik, 1967. The decision makers tend to outweigh the value of possible outcome than the gravity of it. This may lead to anchoring of decision to certain key values than its relative magnitude. Analogous to this is the tendency of the decision maker to view the problem as unique, and hence prior hypotheses also become irrelevant. Kahneman and Lovallo, 1993. Thus negligence of the statistical data and insensitivity to validity estimates strongly influence the reliability of the decisions. 3.1.9 Perceived control over situation. Perceiving control over situation may result in illusion of manageability. Such a feeling perhaps manifests in two ways, where firstly the individual may perceive probability of success higher than failure and then perceive greater control of the situation. Langer, 1975, Langer and Roth, 1975 and Lefcourt, 1973. This can also be viewed as optimistic bias, where positive illusions may be created for the success and manipulation. Psychology paper number 1 Cognitive Science. Ignoring the inherent risks in the situations. Post-decisional control, Shapira, 1995, where the individual may feel that decisions can be corrected, reversed after they are taken, may act as serious threat to decision-making process. 4. Types of cognitive biases. Patterns of deviation in the thought process may lead to errors in judgment. The tilts in cognition begin with the biases at the sensory stage itself and may intensify to psychological and social level as well. 4.1 Sensory biases. Various sensory biases predispose an individual to maintain status quo and avoid cognitive investment in thoughts outside the realm of direct experiences. As humans, we react to the information that is received by the 5 sense organs and filter events falling out of the sensory domain. Biases at the sensory level operate when sensory organs and the cognitive machinery reacts in a way to perceive real threats and ignore abstract or vague information. The bias to perceive negative information is stronger than positive, and also if it is a first-hand information rather than secondary sources such as newspaper or television. Sensory biases thus focus our attention on real threats and shield it from abstract or hypothetical threats. 4.2 Psychological biases. Research in the area of cognitive psychology reveals important role of psychological biases in maintaining the status quo. Fisk and Taylor, 2007, Sears, Huddy and Jervin, 2003. Convenient mindsets are sought as a result of psychological biases. Such biases at one place preserve the cognitive investment in dealing with experiences outside the cognitive realm and at the same time also explain the failure in decision-making process. 4.2.1 Positive illusions. Also referred to as optimistic bias, it refers to the tendency of an individual to exhibit over-optimistic view of own ability, control over future events, discounting the evidences for the possible impediment. This may lead to an individual's overconfidence of the own self and vulnerability to risk. Such illusionary optimism may be attributed to the precursors such as ambiguity in situation, lack of feedback, anticipation of threat, and have been cited to be major cause of policy failures and disasters in politics and economics. Johnson, 2004, Wrangham, 1999, Griffin and Tversky, 2002. 4.2.2 Fundamental attribution error. It refers to a bias in explaining others' behavior. According to this bias, when we try to seek causes of others' behavior, we tend to overemphasize the role of dispositional factors while ignoring the potential situational factors. The major causes of such attribution error could be more interest in others' behavior, poor communication, lack of self-confidence, negative experiences in past. For instance, if we happen to view an accident, we happen to attribute it to the carelessness of the driver than situational cause like poor lighting over the street or fault in the car, etc. 4.2.3 Hindsight bias, also termed as I knew it all along effect. It refers to the increased likelihood to see the past events as predictable at the time when it happened. It relates to the Psychology paper number 1 Cognitive Science. Tendency to see greater predictability of the events that have already occurred than when they had not taken place, which may also be viewed as exaggerated view of anticipation in foresight. Such bias causes the individual to rely too heavily on the knowledge acquired from previous events and accept inadequate explanations of the same. 4.2.4 Cognitive dissonance. Contradictory information disturbs the psychological equilibrium, and as a result individual tends to select and organize conflicting data to accommodate with the pre-existing views and beliefs. Another likelihood of the individual is to deliberately avoid the discrepant information so as to reduce cognitive dissonance. The common reasons for such inclination could be strong ideological motives, commitment to a given policy, inability to adapt to new information, strong threat to interests, etc. 4.2.5 In-group out-group bias. It refers to the common tendency of the people to have a favorable view of in-group members and an inferior view of out-group members. It is the process by which group members seek self-esteem from their comparisons with the other group inmates. Possible explanations for the biased perspective could be perceived intergroup threat and lack of communication among the group members. 4.2.6 Attention bias. The tendency to focus on a particular set of information while ignoring the other relevant information is called attentional bias. It relates to the likelihood of our perception to be affected by our internal recurring thoughts. Attentional bias has been viewed to occur in various disorders such as depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or eating disorder. In case of depression, selective attention towards negative information, whereas in case of OCD, discriminatory attention towards object of obsession, and in realm of eating disorder, selective attention towards food-related stimuli in comparison to neutral stimuli clearly reflects attentional bias. 4.2.7 Memory bias. The impairment or facilitation of recall or alteration of contents of memory refers to memory bias. It may get manifested in the chances of information being recalled or the time taken to recall or alteration in the contents of recalled information. There are various types of memory biases such as false memory, which is a misattribution where an imagination is mistaken for a memory, illusory correlation depicting an accurate remembering of correlation between two events, or humor effect where presence of humor may facilitate the memory of the events. 4.2.8 Confirmation bias. The tendency to selectively choose, interpret, focus on and remember information so as to confirm already existing notions is called confirmation bias. Such predisposition aims to fail search for disconfirming evidences and to favor existing beliefs and theories. Also, ambiguous evidence is interpreted as supporting existing beliefs or theories. This kind of bias in decision-making may lead to a reflexive loop where a flawed decision may influence what we observe, which in turn further leads to another erroneous situation. It takes a reverse view where the decision has already been taken and now the evidence to support the decision needs to be gathered. It may also act as major precursor of groupthink in the organizations. 4. Point 2.9 Effect heuristic. It refers to the way in which subjective impressions of good and bad influences the decision-making process. It is potent to create perceptual judgments and systematic. Psychology paper number 1 Cognitive Science. Biases. It is a mental shortcut facilitating decision-making process based on current state of emotions. The tactic is specially relied upon while judging cost benefits of act, event or person, depending on the positive or negative feelings that people associate with them. If the individual's feelings towards an activity are positive, then greater is the likelihood to judge the risks as low and the benefits high. On the other hand, if the feelings depicted are negative, then the risk is perceived higher than benefits. 4.3 Social biases. Social bias can be understood as prejudicial attitudes directed towards particular communities such as races, sexes, or religions, including the conscious or unconscious expression of these attitudes in writing, speaking, etc. It is the existence of prejudiced action prior to any actual behavior that can be termed as discrimination. Besides the conventional definition, social bias also tends to focus on various other unfamiliar social differences and its impact on the social behavior. Two prime ideas seem to be inherent in the concept of social biases: a, its strong differentiation with discrimination, which may refer to the behavioral component of prejudice than cognitive or affective component; b, it offers space for identification of the causes for social biases. At the same time, strategies to mitigate the effects of such biases should also be devised. The understanding should focus on protecting against judgment error and acknowledging social accuracy to be as important as any other form of accuracy. 4.3.1 Actor-observer effect. It is an extension of fundamental attribution error where the dispositional factors are overemphasized in explaining others' behavior, whereas external, situational factors are strongly recommended while attributing the cause for self-behavior. It is the likelihood of individual to attribute own behavior to situational factors such as limited choices, priorities, competing concerns, etc., and others' behavior to dispositional causes such as characteristics, personality traits, intentions, etc. For instance, people are more likely to view national policies and changes in light of administrators' vested interests, whereas own behavior is a responsible citizen limited by situational barriers. 4.3.2 Egocentric bias. It refers to the tendency to see oneself as both cause and target of another's behavior. The individual perceives oneself at the epicenter to the events in the environment. It primarily involves two aspects: a tendency to organize memory in context of self, b, to view oneself as the cause and effect of others' actions. It manifests when one thinks of the world from his perspective only and refuses to consider the other people's viewpoint. 4.3.3 Halo effect. It deals with the likelihood of the observer's evaluation of a person to be completely influenced by the impression formed in his mind. The term was propounded by eminent psychologist E. L. Thorndike, 1920, referring to the person being perceived as a halo. It is also used in brand marketing where one positive characteristic of an item also positively influences the marketability of a larger brand. 4.3.4 Self-serving bias. It refers to the tendency to attribute own success to the dispositional causes and failures to external factors. It aims to enhance self-esteem by protecting the ego from threat and injury. To illustrate with a common example, students generally attribute their psychology paper number 1 cognitive science successful performance in exams to their hard work and preparation, whereas a failure in the exam to tough question paper or strict checking or poor teaching. 4.4.4 Belief in just world. It states that an action of an individual is followed by morally fair and deserved consequences. It purports that people tend to believe in a just world in which everyone gets what they deserve, whereby all noble actions are positively reinforced and bad deeds are punished. Such a belief enables them to justify misfortune, thus serving important adaptive functions. As a result, people are motivated to explain injustices by their belief in a just world. Its common manifestation in everyday language is to get what one deserves in the just world. 4.4.5 Projection bias. The tendency of the individual to assume that others also share same beliefs, thoughts, attitude as one has nurtured in own self is referred to as projection bias. It is the likelihood to assume that others also share same emotional states, values and beliefs as one does. This type of bias operates very commonly in daily life when we see our friends more likely to be similar to us than actually they are. A major impact of this bias is that individual fails to recognize the true, actual thoughts and beliefs of others and remains in factitious world of perceived similarity. 4.4.6 False consensus effect. It refers to the tendency of an individual to overestimate the degree of others' agreement with their viewpoint. This type of tilt operates because we think that our opinion and beliefs are appropriate, therefore others should also be sharing the same. A very common example of the same could be to believe that others should also believe that cleanliness is important because we believe in that way, or believing that every marriage should be essentially followed by having children as procreation is the only goal and consequence of marriage. 4.6.7 Bystander apathy. It refers to the tendency of the individual not to respond to the emergencies on the road or in the environment when being in a group than individually. It occurs as a result of diffusion of responsibility where one assumes that other people standing there will resume with the responsibilities and take charge of it. Also, pluralistic ignorance emerges where emergency may not be perceived in first case, and if it is perceived, all may feel that others are there to handle the situation. Finally, in many cases, the victim may be left out without receiving any help. 4.4 Organizational biases. An organization can be defined as a collection of people working towards common goal. Various organizational biases emerge as a result of inertia, groupthink, vested interests, promotion stunts, sunk costs, etc. Bureaucratic politics model of decision-making is generally used to explain the failure in the decision-making process. The judgment errors in organizations can be generally attributed to various implicit factors such as internal policies, centralization of the decision-making power, anachronistic belief, maladaptive expectancies, etc. One of the major biases predominant in organizations is that of groupthink, where entire group may be directed towards rigid form of thinking and may not be able to break conventional ties. Such conformity to decision without critical evaluation may result in irrational or dysfunctional decisional outcome. 4.5 Decision-making biases. Psychology paper number 1 Cognitive science. The process of decision-making refers to series of steps involved in choosing the right alternative as a solution from a varied set of possibilities. Biases generally creep and alter the decision-making process. This may arise as a result of lack of objective parameters and more room for subjective interpretations. Biases in decision-making can act as divisive forces as they often lead to compromised results in terms of ideal outcome. They aim to interfere with the rationality of the decision and also vary in nature as are considerably numerous. Many times they tend to disrupt logical contemplation of decision by introducing various externalities potentially irrelevant to the task at hand. Important known manifested in biases in decision-making process are as follows. 4.5.1 Base rate fallacy. It refers to the phenomenon of ignoring the available statistical data and selectively dealing with specific data in order to outweigh a probability judgment. It encompasses overlooking the generic data or base rate and giving more importance to the case-related data. A reject to the holistic view of the situation leads to a calculation error and disrupt the judgment. It leads to jumping down on the conclusion while ignoring all the relevant data and in favor of specific data, thus relying more on intuitive thinking than rational thinking. 4.5.2 Gambler's fallacy. It relates to the tendency to overestimate the possibility of an event to occur in future if at present it has occurred less than the normal frequency, or underestimate if it has happened more than expected period of time. A classical example would be flipping of the coins, where if one receives heads 5 times consecutively, then probability of receiving a tail 6th time is overestimated. 4.5.3 Illusory correlation. The term is propounded by Chapman and Chapman, 1967, and referred to the tendency to inaccurately perceive a relationship between two unrelated events. An everyday example could be to perceive any boy and girl being together as romantic partners, whereas they could just be friends. Similarly, to draw a relation between pain and weather. This generally happens when people pay less attention to the general data and focus on relatively small observations. 4.5.4 Negativity bias. A memory bias where the individual tends to have an enhanced recall of unpleasant memories than positive or neutral memories. It deals with the propensity to attend to, learn from and apply negative information while making decisions. It entails that negative events dominate in the conscious experience than positive memories. A classical example of negativity bias: while going on a road we tend to recall the accident position if encountered than remembering most of the neutral moments when we have crossed the road normally without viewing any accident. 4.5. Framing effect. It refers to the incoherence, inaccuracy in decision making and a strong precursor to rationality debate. It deals with drawing different conclusions from an information depending on how the information is presented. In simple terms, if the information is presented with Gaines' positive frame, then it may elicit positive judgment. In contrast, when it is reflected with a negative frame, it may lead to a harsh judgment. In both the cases, rationality is challenged, which should form the base of any decision-making process. Psychology paper number 1, Cognitive Science. 5. Mitigating cognitive biases. Severity of cognitive biases in processing of information and producing judgment errors has been well recognized. The persistence of such tilts pose a great threat to the decision-making process. To mitigate such effects, attempts have been directed towards challenging the maintenance of underlying cognitive biases. The profound impact on the process of negotiation warrants instant focus on the mitigating strategies such as 5.1 Metacognitive awareness. The insightful awareness of the presence of judgment errors and its impact in the decision-making process may help in reducing such biases. A way suggested is to look at it as with impersonal involvement in order to have an objective view of the same. With metacognitive awareness, regulation in terms of monitoring and control may also emerge. 5.2 Review of past. While making decisions, it almost becomes imperative to critically review the events of past. An objective overlook at the previous experiences and engagement with the process of decision-making may neutralize the anticipated biases. Also, with the review of the past, a persistent pattern of deviation may also be identified. 5.3 Hypothesis testing. Putting the implicit assumptions to explicit check and testing its validity would perhaps combat functional fixes. The technique focuses on treating dysfunctional thoughts as hypothesis, which is subject to criticism by rational argument and refutation by empirical evidence, and thereby correcting the unproductive thought process. 5.4 Reconfiguration of group dynamics. In an attempt to reduce cognitive tilts, it is at times essential to diversify the group members in order to break the groupthink. The diversity of the thought process can protect the group from being a victim of such biases. Presence of multiple unconventional cognitive paradigms can also enhance creativity in decision-making process. 5.5 Receptivity to alternate views. A prerequisite to make cognitive process impartial is to allow space for alternate solutions. Receptivity to alternate perspective, especially from an outsider, can really highlight neutrality in decision-making process. But at the same time, the vested interests of the consultants and other external factors such as their pay or comfort should not contaminate the objective judgment. 5.6 Increase of cognitive exposure. The foundation of cognition lies on construction of schemas and belief system based on experiences. Increasing the availability of information from various sources and putting it to critical analysis like a devil advocate may help in combating the cognitive skewness. The exposure to wider cognitive field, carefully avoiding the information overload, may help in mitigating such biases. 5.7 Cognitive Bias Modification Therapy, CBMT. Recent trends have focused on CBMT as a novel set of treatment modality aiming to change cognitive processes. Also referred to as applied processing cognitive therapy, as it focuses on cognitive training, interpretation and imagery modifications. Psychology paper number 1, Cognitive Science. 5. Summary. Cognitive bias is a pattern of deviation in judgment occurring as a result of tilts in information processing. There are various causes of cognitive biases, such as relying on heuristics, cognitive traffic, social influences, anchoring to prior hypotheses, and perceived control over situations. Cognitive biases can be categorized into various types such as sensory, psychological, social, organizational, political, and judgmental. Remediation of cognitive biases can be achieved through increasing metacognitive awareness and exposure, receptivity to alternate views, testing of hypotheses, and use of cognitive bias modification therapy. 2. Introduction. Executive functions remain at the epicenter of the human cognition. Managing our lives involves coordination of various sub-processes such as planning, judgment, execution that primarily depend upon the executive functions of the brain. In view of this managerial and administrative quality of the task, these functions are purposely termed as executive functions. Just like an executive of a company who involves himself in planning, managing, and execution of work, the executive functions of the brain also entail in the process of planning, problem-solving, decision-making, and execution of various activities. The entire working of the human body is governed by the commands of executive functions. The term, executive function, has been historically used by various psychologists. Broadly, most of the attempts have unified on to refer to an array of cognitive processes involved in planning, problem-solving, organizing behavior, etc., and identification of the related brain areas. The role of frontal lobes and other units in brain was initially well recognized by Oppenheim 1890. He proposed frontal lobes to be involved in tasks of planning, regulating, strategy control, working memory, etc. Luria, 1980, further identified 3 separate units of the brain governing unique activities: 1. Limbic and reticular systems controlling the arousal motivation; 2. Postraumatic cortica areas governing receiving, processing, and storing of information; 3. Frontal lobes involved with planning, monitoring, and execution of activities. Luria related the third unit with performance of executive functions. Analyzing the increasing importance of the executive functions, Lezak stressed on the fluid nature of these functions and how strongly they governed the cognitive and emotional aspects. On the other hand, Baddeley, 1986, propounded the term dysexecutive syndrome, connoting aberrations in the performance of executive functions. Problems in planning, organizing, regulating, task shifting, fluency, inhibition were included as the symptoms of the syndrome. In totality, most of the thinkers focused on executive functions as governed by the brain areas to be at the nucleus of human cognition and to include various functions of planning, management, and execution at the epicenter. 3. Executive functions. 3.1 Meaning. Like various other cognitive processes, executive functions also lack an intuitive lay concept. Yet various attempts have been directed towards developing an agreeable definition of the concept. Recent attempts have defined executive functions as those indulged in complex cognitions, such. Psychology paper number. Paper 1. Cognitive Science. as concept formation, solving novel question, assimilation, adaptation, developing strategic approach or sequencing. Complex actions. In another modern review, executive function are identified as a product of the coordinated operation of various processes to accomplish a particular goal in a flexible manner. These functions are also viewed as playing a critical role in construction of mature cognitions. The ability of the individual to hold and manipulate information in mind, to be able to act on alternatives rather than pure impulses, to exercise self-monitoring and to be able to flexibly shift to the changing cognitive tasks fall into the domain of adequate executive functioning. In other words, working memory, inhibition, task switching emerge as major components of frontal lobe functions, a term used synonymous to executive functions. 3.1.1 Key components of executive functions. 3.1.1.1 Working memory. It deals with holding information in mind while working or manipulating the information. It involves mental activities such as being able to relate one idea to another, performing mental maths, relating previous information with new learned information and sequencing the information. Working memory turns to be extremely important to have a multidimensional view of thought or action, critical thinking, execute action plans and to enhance creativity. 3.1.1.2 Inhibitory control. It refers to the ability to establish an impulse control and decide on actions based on priority. It entails the potential to be able to resist the first impulse which may also be socially inappropriate, persistence on the task besides boredom and distraction and to have enhanced selective or sustained attention. Inhibitory control turns out to be extremely important in order to establish discipline and conduct in behavior, social politeness and appropriateness at the same time a control over attention from distraction and impulses. 3.1.1.3 Task switching, also known as cognitive flexibility, it involves the mental shifting of one task to another. It is the ability to flexibly shift over perspectives and to adjust to new ones. In the process, it demands attention to be focused on the new task and at the same time to be defocused from the old task. Cognitive flexibility emerges as an essential component for critical problem solving and creativity. 3.1.1.4 Judgment. It refers to the individual's ability to critically appraise a set of information. The potency to evaluate costs and benefits of an action at the same time being able to view it in light of past experiences is called judgment. Evaluating the opportunity cost of an action in relation to self-need, satisfaction, practicality, repercussions, moral values, social pressures, risk-taking capacity entails the critical act of judgment. Orientation, imagination, anticipation, prediction all emerge as core cognitive concepts involved in judgment of an action. 3.1.1.5 Decision making. In our everyday lives we spend majority of the time making decisions about almost all spheres such as finance, relations, work, social life, etc. Decision making as a process involves choosing the justifiable option out of various alternatives available to us. The process is again directed towards the goal of seeking solution to a problem. Judgment forms an imperative part of decision making. It connotes critical appraisal of events and phenomena influencing opinion formation. Nevertheless, it is a continuous process without involving any cognitive exertion. The thin line of difference between decision-making and judgment is that former entails making choices whereas latter deals with qualitative evaluation and analysis of stored or received information. Psychology paper number. Paper 1. Cognitive science. 3.1.1.6 Planning. The mature cognitive ability to foresee events and give them a space-time sequence is known as the act of planning. The organization of events and its management involve intensive process of planning. A simple example of planning could be organizing a birthday party which would involve arranging and managing of events in appropriate time and space. Planning as a mental act is generally followed with execution which determines the success or failure of planning. Both planning and execution go hand in hand where planning without execution could be less hazardous than execution without planning which would certainly reflect poor inhibitory control. 3.1.1.7 Thinking and reasoning. The process of cognitive rearrangement and manipulation of events facilitating adaptation to the environment is conceived as thinking. It is perceived to be a constructive process of creating new schemas with active assimilation and accommodation process. Thinking involves interaction of various other mental activities such as reasoning, problem solving, judgment, abstraction, deduction, etc. Pedestal to thinking is the interface between concepts and ability of reasoning. Concept refers to mental categories representing objects, ideas, abstractions, organisms, etc. The organization of knowledge in hierarchy and system is provided by concepts which are clearly manifested in behavior than explicitly seen. Reasoning, on the other hand, emerges from logical thinking and inference to seek solution to a problem. Rationalizing events based on stored information, experiences, knowledge, rules encompass goal-directed thinking. Reasoning is broadly of two types, deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning allows drawing of inferences from set of assertions whereas inductive reasoning deals with development of general assumption based on small evidences. Both types of reasoning are goal-directed and are aimed at problem solving. The flexible coordination of the above-mentioned sub-processes directed to achieve a specific goal is the responsibility of executive control systems. An aberration with such system may totally lead to disjointed, disinhibited and poorly controlled behavior. Coordination, control, flexibility and goal orientation, therefore, lie at the heart of the concept of executive function. 3.2 Process. The process or actions of the executive functions include initiating, regulating, maintaining, terminating. It also involves other cognitive abilities such as planning when faced with new settings or situations, forming ideas, storing information in and accessing it from working memory, controlling emotions, and thinking abstractly. These functions may follow some steps in sequence such as Step 1. Start. At this step the individual begins with a question or a problem in mind and aims to devise ways to solve the problem. In order to look for a solution, the individual also resorts to past experiences, values, probabilities, new possibilities, etc. Step 2. Maintain. It deals with continuing the action, regulating and updating the changes. Psychology paper number. Paper 1. Cognitive science. Step 3. Switch. This step marks the person's ability to exhibit cognitive flexibility by switching over the tasks. It entails completion of one task and starting the other one. Step 4. Stop. This step involves termination of the task and evaluation of the outcomes. An example to illustrate the process of executive functioning is to view how to pay a bill. This will involve series of steps such as 1. What action to be done, bill to be paid. 2. To execute the action, what are the requirements, to find the checkbook or to avail cash. 4. 3. After arranging for the requirements, when to shift to the next step, such as fill in the details of the checkbook or the receipt for cash. 4. Further, when to move to the subsequent step, checking the details and signing against the name. 5. Lastly, to terminate after completion of the steps, such as to submit the check or cash and collect paid receipt. In the entire range of activities, the feedback about the quality of each step determines the move to the subsequent step and finally the overall evaluation to ascertain the termination of the activity. Certain finer brain actions involved in the frontal lobe functions include 1. Generating ideas and converting into action. 2. Beginning with an action. 3. Continuing the action until the step is over. 4. Transacting cognitively and physically to start with next step. 5. Monitoring and manipulating body actions to adapt with changes and new information along the way. 6. Devising a policy down to interact with new challenges. 7. Holding details in the working memory. 8. Managing and expressing emotions. 9. Thinking abstractly and critically. 10. Acknowledging the completion of the task, terminating the action and smoothly transacting to the next level or activity. 3.3 Role of brain. Fig. 1. Exhibiting different lobes of the brain and their specific functions. Psychology paper number. Paper 1. Cognitive science. Psychology paper number. Paper 1. Cognitive science. Appropriate executive functioning relies on healthy frontal lobes, which are located in the top front part of the brain, just above the forehead. This part of the brain controls vital functions and exhibits persistent development from adolescence to adulthood. Some of the critical actions of the frontal lobe include controlling body movement, emotional regulation, attention, motivation, and other thinking functions such as problem solving, decision making, abstract thinking, critical reasoning, working memory, planning and execution of events. Most of the neuropsychological literature unifies to the view that adequate performance of the executive functions on the neuropsychological diagnostics primarily depend upon the right functioning of the frontal cortex. However, the recent view considers it to be a simplistic explanation and asserts the role of subcortical regions also to play in it. Nevertheless, the vitality of the frontal cortex in successful performance of executive functions is so strongly established that many times the terms executive functions and frontal lobe functions are used interchangeably. For instance, in case of Parkinson's disease, the neuropsychological tests pose striatal structures anomaly to determine successful functioning of the executive process. The synonymous use of the term executive functions with frontal lobe functions is strongly supported by the robust role of prefrontal cortex as well. This area has particularly been involved in coordination of multifunctions. Hence, damage to this area exhibits cognitive impairments such as intellectual deficits, lack of organization, planning, judgment and decision making. It also depicts behavioral deficits like uncontrolled, disjointed behavior and lack of functional unity in the behavior. Such patients generally fail on the subtests of planning, set shifting and fluency. However, they tend to exhibit more than average performance on tests requiring to focus on one specific function. This suggests a deficit in the coordination process and hence a lack of behavioral unity. Recent view also suggests a biological and functional connection between frontal lobe and stratum in governing the executive functions. Corticostriatal circuitry in the brain links frontal cortex to the striatal structures through thalamus and globus pallidus. Various neuropsychological studies pose that stratum plays a crucial role in working of the executive functions. A common example of the same is Parkinson's disease, which exhibits symptoms when aberration is just limited to the basal ganglia and also in patients without undergoing any treatment. This suggested basal ganglia, corticostriatal circuitry to be closely associated with executive functions and also prefrontal cortex. 4. Cognition. 4.1 Difference between executive functions and cognition. There is a thin line of difference that is generally perceived between executive functions and cognition and the term executive function is used as an umbrella concept to include various complex cognitive processes and sub-processes. By and large, various attempts to define executive functions include processes such as inhibitory control, cognitive flexibility, working memory, planning, organizing, etc., which suggests executive functions not to be a single unitary idea. On the other hand, cognition can be perceived as information processing capacity generally. Psychology paper number. Paper 1. Cognitive science. Controlled by the executive functions. Probably the good way to establish distinction between executive functions and cognitive abilities is to view executive function as a larger domain monitoring, regulating the execution of various cognitive abilities. The control over the execution of automatic cognitive abilities lies with the executive functions. To give an example, writing like dictation can be automatic, but thinking and writing or creative writing will involve attention, set shifting, working memory, which are essentially part of larger executive functions. Also, cognitive abilities should be understood as an amalgamation of various abilities such as visuomotor ability, spatial ability, reading writing ability, abstract reasoning ability, linguistic ability, etc. Implicit to each of these abilities would be both executive and non-executive functions, giving it a functional unity. Also, strong correlation between the various cognitive abilities is attributed to the surfacing of executive functions. 4.2 Assessment of cognitive deficits. Recent development in the field of neuroimaging has made possible the assessment of neuronal base of executive functions. A robust advantage of the neuroimaging approach is the ability to minutely dissect and discern the area of brain involved and the degree of involvement. Also, it has helped to move beyond the simple explanation of frontal lobe involvement to other intricate areas such as prefrontal cortex, basal ganglia, and stratum. Another strong advantage of this technique is to be able to distinguish between psychiatric and neurological executive deficits and at the same time also assert the prognosis and possibility of treatment. Conforming to the previous view, neuropsychological data purports executive functions to be closely related to intact functioning of the frontal cortices. Thus, executive dysfunction viewed in various pathologies is more or less attributed to structural or functional frontal anomaly mediated by flexible connecting networks. As a result, the recovery of executive functions due to functional reorganization within executive networks post-brain injury also acts as a strong evidence of the same. This relationship has been confirmed by various PET and fMRI scans. However, the establishment of minute prefrontal foci with executive functions has been still inconclusive. Nevertheless, various psychological tests are also used in support to neuroimaging evidences. For instance, Luria Nebraska Battery, Bender Gestalt test are used to assess specific executive functions. 5. Nature of cognitive deficits in various disorders. In most of the psychiatric disorders, executive dysfunction is caused as a result of frontal lobe damage and stratum lesions. A few deficits which are related to progressive disorders are dementia, Parkinson's, and other psychiatric pathologies such as depression, schizophrenia, etc. 5.1 Aging and executive functions. Psychology paper number. Paper 1. Cognitive science. Literature reveals depreciation in executive functions is a result of increase in age. On the other hand, in instances of accidents leading to head injury or stroke, sudden deficits in executive functions are more common than progressive, whereas in other cases, the deficits surface progressively. In case of progressive decline such as Alzheimer's or frontal dementia or a related memory disorder, the executive deficits fluctuate. The symptoms may appear few days or it may be just absent for few weeks altogether. Gradually, the symptoms may form a pattern, and as age increases, the deficits may become more marked and stable over time. Consequently, the role of caregiver may become stronger with increase in responsibilities, especially in the case of self-care and memory deficits. Following are the major deficits that may occur in dementia. 1. Difficulty in sequencing actions such as picking an object, using it and keeping it back after use. 2. Difficulty in set shifting, where an individual may have trouble in starting, continuing, and closing an action. For instance, in case of eating meal, the person may forget to start and after initiating may be reminded again to eat further and stop once the stomach is full. 3. Deficit in working memory may surface where the individual may have problem in retaining the information while working upon it. For example, while talking about an event suddenly forgetting and losing the track of information. 4. Difficulty in keeping emotions constant and connected with each other. There may be certain extreme liability of mood and expression. The patient may suddenly depict a strong outburst of emotion which may at times appear an overreaction to a genuine situation or at times just may be extremely apathetic to an emotional situation. Such kind of extremity may become extremely touchy for the caregiver to handle. 5. In the same view, it may also become a challenge for the patient to control from oneself from giving harsh, rude comments which may at times also sound illogical. For instance, the getting hurt somewhere while walking, the patient may start blaming the objects being kept at wrong places or the light which may be less. The patient may just tend to produce irrational justifications for a behavior. 6. Such patients may also show a difficulty in following authority, rules, and limits. The individual may just not follow the traffic signals or no parking signs while moving on the road. Spontaneous rude comments may be difficult to stop, keeping the authorities surprised of overacting in spite of the plausible fault. 7. Impulsivity may become strongly evident in everyday behavior. Learning from past experiences and its application in the decision may just not get reflected. An example of the same may be shown in impulsive shopping of things in huge numbers which may just not be used. 8. Sequencing and turn-taking in conversation might also pose a strong challenge. Slow motion in actions and also at times in conversation may become very common. Psychology paper number. Paper 1. Cognitive science. 9. Self-monitoring may be completely absent. The patient may be self-blind and not able to see his mistakes. The realization or correction in mistakes thus may not follow. 10. Shitting in tasks, ideas, emotions may become most difficult for these patients. It may seem as if they are stuck somewhere and are not able to come out of it. 11. Difficulty in planning. Organizing a spontaneous response in an unexpected situation is extremely problematic for these patients. For example, to take another route if one is blocked or diverted. 5.2 Cognitive deficits in schizophrenia and mood disorders. Several attempts have been initiated to understand the cognitive deficits in schizophrenia and mood disorders. However, the findings are still inconclusive. Such deficits may interfere with multiple aspects of functioning such as processing speed manifested in delayed response, slowness in following directions, and perceptual organization reflected in failure of visual spatial ability, attention, understanding of number and letters due to their inaccurate processing of shape. A large analysis of literature suggests presence of cognitive deficits both in schizophrenia and mood disorders, though the nature of such impairments may vary qualitatively. Schizophrenia being a psychotic disorder, might exhibit intense deficits to an extent that there is a debate for inclusion of these deficits as a core diagnostic indicator in DSM-B, Elbibach, and Goldberg, 2000. Despite the heterogeneity, there are certain cognitive deficits which are communal to schizophrenia and mood disorders such as a decrease in working memory, attention, psychomotor speed, task planning, visual spatial abilities, etc. Shretlin, 2007. 6. Summary. 1. Executive functions refer to mature cognition involving concept formation, solving novel problems, assimilation, and adaptation, developing strategic approach or sequencing complex actions. 2. Key components of executive functions include inhibitory control, cognitive flexibility, working memory, planning, judgment, reasoning, etc. 3. The process of executive functioning includes starting with an idea, maintaining and regulating it, switching over to another mental content and terminating the action. 4. The role of brain is extremely robust in controlling executive functions. Frontal lobe is identified as the key area involved. Recent review suggests role of prefrontal cortex and basal ganglia also in working of the executive functions. Psychology paper 1. Cognitive science. 5. Executive dysfunction may occur as a result of frontal lobe lesions or damage to basal ganglia. As a result, deficits in intellectual ability, coordination, memory, planning may exhibit very clearly. 6. Executive functions and cognition differ from each other in the way that executive functions act as an umbrella concept including cognitive processes and sub-processes. On the other hand, cognition may be viewed as set of cognitive abilities such as reading, writing ability, linguistic ability, each preserving executive and non-executive functions. 7. Neuroimaging is viewed to be the most reliable assessment procedure for executive functions. The role of frontal lobe and stratum has been well documented in the assessment procedures. 8. Cognitive deficits may be seen in various disorders, especially disorders related to aging such as dementia, Alzheimer's and other psychiatric disorders such as schizophrenia, depression and bipolar disorder. The deficits may surface in each of the disorders, however, the magnitude of occurrence may strongly vary. Psychology. 2. Introduction. History of metacognition. The vitality of metacognition in human experience has been well recognized. Rise of interest in this area is distinctly exhibited with the expansion of research and influence over other disciplines. Even before the inception of psychology with an independent discipline identity, the thought over metacognition still pervaded. The knowledge of our own selves, as it was perceived early by Descartes or Augustine, was thought to be a unique capacity of disembodied soul. Conversely, the growing body of modern literature viewed metacognition as a unique mental potential sustained by a phenomenological experience specific to humans. This view strongly endorsed and carried a considerable appeal. The deliberation over own perceptions, memory, thinking led the early thinkers like Descartes to believe that there existed a non-physical soul. Also that this embodiment was only specific to humans as animals, evidence emerging from the fact that other primates such as animals did not have language. Terrace, 2005, Terrace and Metcalf, 2005. The non-dualist also considered it to be a unique cognitive capacity owing its origin from the evolutionary process. The capacity to self-reflex was viewed to bear a strong adaptive value. The view of non-physical soul was paradoxical for Comte, where he postulated that how mind could serve as a function and observer of its function as well. The paradox rested on the idea that consciousness was united in comparison to be fragmented. If then consciousness was to serve as a function and observe its own functioning, it was then essentially fragmented. The paradox was then related to the perception in itself being fragmentary yet bearing a holistic perspective. This idea of perceptual continuity was well supported by multimodality functioning, where one could listen to music and at the same time solve math yet share a spotlight of attention. Another plausible view to the paradox mentioned was that even if consciousness was united, still function and observation of function may not happen at the same psychological moment. In one moment, the function could occur and in the next the appraisal may happen, making both the processes independent in time. The neuroscience also supported the co-occurrence of acting, monitoring, regulating and evaluating own functions. The paradox ignited research in the area where attempts were directed to seek a theoretical solution to the postulation. Nelson and Narens, L. 990 proposed that for consciousness to perform two functions simultaneously it must exist at two levels, one at the object or doing level, another at the meta level of judging own functioning. The view was well endorsed and served as the foundation for the phenomena of metacognition. Psychology paper 1, Cognitive Science. 3. Meaning and concept of metacognition. Metacognition refers to one's knowledge of own cognitive processes. The term meta connotes beyond, hence metacognition indicates to the process of going beyond the mere occurrence of cognitive processes and engaging into its awareness, knowledge and regulation. Metacognition operates at three levels: metacognitive knowledge, regulation and experiences. Metacognitive knowledge deals with knowing about own cognitive processes and have to be differentiated from metacognitive skills. The former is based on declarative knowledge acquired through the interaction with the environment, person, task, and situation, and latter is based on procedural knowledge dealing with modus operandi of cognitive activity. Skills differ from knowledge in terms of being action-based and knowledge only being awareness of the cognitive activity. Conditional knowledge, on the other hand, deals with choice of action at specific time based on metacognitive awareness. Similarly, metacognitive regulation relates to control and manipulation of cognitive capacities, and metacognitive experiences refer to current state of cognitive affairs. All the three components prove imperative for higher order thinking. The phenomenon thus goes beyond mere thinking about thinking to monitoring, control and regulation of thought. Fig 1. Depicting three levels of metacognition. Expansion of research in the area of metacognition entails rationalization and evaluation of one's own executive functions regulating the information processing capacities. Synthesis of various interpretations indicates meta X being X of X, so metacognition is cognition of cognition, metaknowledge is knowledge of knowledge. Traditionally under this umbrella concept of metacognition various related terms were included such as metacognitive beliefs, metacognitive awareness, feeling of knowledge, theory of mind, metamemory, which confuse the distinctiveness of the domain. Some terms elaborated on more general forms of knowledge whereas others dealt with age-specific processing. Some concepts are purely metacognitive whereas others are cognitive and metacognitive as well, such as learning, thinking, etc. For instance, the idea of self-regulating was considered a secondary concept to metacognition. Metacognition. Metaknowledge. Proctoral knowledge, declarative knowledge, conditional knowledge, Metarigualtian. Monitoring, planning, evaluation. Metacognitive experiences. Appraisal of cognitive experiences. Psychology paper 1, Cognitive Science. Whereas other research is viewed it as a superordinate to metacognition. Such kind of paradoxes has led to lack of Functional unity in the concept of metacognition. Nelson's view of consciousness operating at object in the meta level then provided clarification to the idea. The actual cognitive process operated at the object level, whereas reasoning functioned at the meta level. The idea about the state of function level is conveyed to the meta level through series of regulating, monitoring processes, and the feedback from the meta level to the object level is transcended by the control processes. The flow of information is bidirectional and postulates consciousness to be piecemeal and fragmentary. The idea is reflective of metacognitive knowledge and skills where a lapse at the object level would be transmitted to meta level, which would further also apply appropriate skills directed towards solution of the problem. Thus, metacognition is not simply complex discriminative evaluation but rather a judgment that involves information processing called cognition and monitoring of higher order thinking understood as metacognition. 3.1 Conscious or automatic metacognition. Extending the line of investigation to the fact that is metacognition a conscious or more of an automatic process? The view that it is a conscious process entails the involvement of higher order processing. Nelson, 1996 and Schnatz, 1992. The other view represented metacognition to be less of conscious process and more of reflex action. The automaticity is well achieved when the process of onlooking almost turns into a good regular habit. Such evaluations then seem to push itself into the background of conscious experience except in an erroneous situation where entire process may get alarmed. Another perspective to the question added by Bandura was metacognition to be a practice acquired through observational or vicarious learning. Bandura, 1989. It allowed metacognition to be less of a conscious and more of an automatic modeling process. Furthermore, whether conscious metacognition or automatic metacognition would be more self-regulatory will reflect a philosophical disagreement between self-determinism and externally regulated behavior. Also, the difference of metacognitive skill and metacognitive strategy would rely upon again the metacognition being an automatic or a conscious effort. 3.2 General or domain-specific metacognition. The perennial question to metacognition in education is whether it is a general activity or a task-specific process. General metacognition would be synchronized with teaching and would not transcend automatically. Conversely, domain-specific metacognition would require specific teaching pedagogy. More evidence is available for metacognition to be a domain-specific activity, each encompassing customized teaching pedagogy for maths. Dassault and Roeyers, 2003, Kramarski and Meverek, 2003, Science Thomas, 2003, or Reading Abilities Zhang, 2001, and Veenman and Bechusen, 2004. Recent studies attempt to cite differences amongst metacognition of various domains. On the other hand, monitoring skills are taken to be general across domains. Schra, Dunkel, Bendixen and Rodel, 1995, Schra and Neatfeld, 1998. Nonetheless, the dichotomy still pervades and results remain inconclusive. At the initial level, the skills may seem to be more at specific level as each of the tasks may unfold in a different way and require task-oriented strategies. Perhaps at the later level, a more general level of functioning may operate in solving the problems. However, the divergent thinking may emerge from the general metacognitive grounds. Psychology paper number 1, Cognitive Science. 5. Developmental stages in metacognition. Constant renewal of interest has been viewed in identifying the chronological development of metacognition. Theory of mind is believed to be developed around 3 to 5 years of age. Flavel, 2004, followed by metamemory and metacouch to develop and become an ongoing dynamic process. Alexander, Carr and Schwanenflugel, 1995. Metacognitive skills seem to emerge around 811 years and mature throughout. However, skill of planning may establish before then higher order skill of monitoring or evaluation. Conversely, the reports of early infancy show planning, monitoring and evaluation to also become apparent in the tasks of interest. Since acquisition of skills is a developmental process, hence a fixed timeline trajectory may not be defined. It may essentially be viewed in biopsychosocial context. Furthermore, still to have an idea of development, components of metacognition need to be precisely defined, and also the role and impact of one component in the development of the other need to be ascertained. Also, the relation of intelligence with metacognitive skills needs to be highlighted. Does intelligence level increase or decrease the acquisition of metacognitive skills or influence the pace of acquisition? Does intelligence level increase or decrease the acquisition of metacognitive skills or influence the pace of acquisition warrants further research. At the inception level, metacognitive skills may appear to be domain-specific, but later with maturity it may operate in a more generalized fashion. Veenman and Spons, 2005. Thus, to gain holistic perspective of metacognition being conscious or automatic, specific or general, its influential ability and its relatedness with other fields needs to be well explored. 5. Components of metacognition. 5.1 Cognition versus metacognition. Metacognition as phenomena has been implicated to refer to series of epistemological processes. Generally, it is conceived as cognition of cognition, giving it a higher order thinking status. Therefore, if cognitive acts involve perception, thinking, memory, metacognitive acts relate to the awareness, regulation, and control of these events. Flavel, 1978, defined it as knowledge that takes as its object or regulate any aspect of any cognitive endeavor. Moore, 1982, conceptualized it as individual's knowledge of various aspects of thinking, whereas Gavelek and Raffel, 1985, phrased it as the ability of the individual to adjust their cognitive activity in order to promote more effective comprehension. Metacognition then thus emerges as an external higher order spectator to the cognitive process, yet being an integral part of it, which is truly reflective of Comte's paradox. This further indicates that cognition and metacognition both are entwined processes. Metacognition relies on cognition, and at the same time cognition is subject to metacognition. In the context of metacognitive knowledge, it is difficult to have metacognitive knowledge without attaining knowledge of specific domain. Similarly, in case of metamemory, the appraisal of the memory is not possible without any active memory process. At the same time, the self-appraisal and self-management of cognitive concepts provide functional feedback and regulate the cognitive act. The assessment of metacognition is based on the cognitive performance, and evaluation of cognition derives completion from appraisal of metacognitive experiences. This deep interrelation gives circularity to the entire mental phenomena and poses a challenge to disentangle both the components. However, proficiency in metacognition can. Psychology paper number 1, Cognitive Science. compensate for lacks in cognitive components, but high cognitive abilities cannot fill the gap for metacognition. 5.2 Metamemory. Metamemory refers to the introspective examination of one's own memory contents, facilitating judgment and discretion. Thus, metamemory is not memory itself but rather analysis, commentaries, appraisal of the memory index, and learning. For instance, when Descartes was engaged in his famous doubting meditation, musing about how his memories or perceptions could have been different than they were, or how he could have been mistaken about them, he was engaging in metacognition. Such reflection of the phenomenological selves was also highly prone to subjectivity. Since metamemory is primarily judgment and appraisal of the memory index, three basic judgments have formed the core of metamemory research: feeling of knowing judgments, tip of the tongue judgments, and judgment of learning. Though the list of judgments is exhaustive as metamemory concerns any judgment about the memory, so other evaluations such as source judgment, recognition judgment, and confidence judgment also include as imperative part. Metamemory operates at two levels, i.e. the objective level and the meta level. At the objective level, the memories itself is the concern, whereas at the meta level, the regulation of the objective level is involved. 5.3 Metacomprehension. Similarly, the concept of metacomprehension entails cognitive appraisal of one's own comprehension abilities. A classical example would be a student reading a book and not understanding and yet negligent of the fact of not understanding. Such lack of insight over the aspect of understanding and learning makes it purely mechanical. The emphasis of metacomprehension has been particularly on evaluation of one's own reading or speech comprehension. Many times in the classroom settings, it has been observed a wide gap between the child's perception of knowing and his actual knowledge. Thus, the training of metacomprehension strategies during the early school years becomes imperative for the success of learning. 5.4 Problem solving. The attributes of decision-making and problem-solving encompass most of the time of human life. It can be conceived as a cognitive act of choosing wisely amongst the available alternatives and also the ability to perceive a question from varied perspectives. The idea of divergent thinking also gets introduced in problem-solving, where moving beyond the available heuristics and algorithms helps in seeking different, innovative solutions for the problem. It constantly focuses on developing alternatives, evaluating options, exploring the opportunity cost, etc. Most importantly, it entails the cognitive ability to question oneself in terms of redefining the problem, pathway, and the expected outcome. Parallel to the aspect of problem solving is the higher cognitive ability of an individual to evaluate ideas based on their quality, entails critical thinking. It can also be seen complementary to problem solving, where the evaluation of the alternatives could be formalized in terms of various parameters such as clarity, rationality, coherence, expected success, generalizability, etc. This kind of thinking is viewed across disciplines and is just no more a scientific entity. Psychology paper number 1, Cognitive Science. 5.5 Metareasoning. Reasoning is directed towards rationalizing a solution to a problem, and metareasoning is related to the reasoning that generates such solution or delves into the problem. The term metareasoning does not always essentially refer to reasoning of reasoning, but rather reasoning at three levels, i.e. object, reasoning, and the meta level. The object level or ground level entails both rules and propositions specific to domain. The reasoning level involves describing the object and initiating a change in it. Lastly, the meta level process involves progress, evaluation, and outcome of the reasoning level. Thus, processes in the reasoning level alter process at the object level, and process at the meta level ramifies processes at the reasoning level. Thus, metareasoning involves reasoning of the reasoning cycle. It involves both the processes, meta-level control of rationalizations, and introspective regulation of reasoning. The goal of meta-level is to develop the quality of decisions by monitoring the reasoning investment, whereas the aim of introspective monitoring is to make efficient meta-level control strategies. Meta-level is thus engaged in generating plausible causes for reasoning-level decisions influencing object-level performance. It may also involve itself in attributing causes at object of reasoning level in case of a reasoning failure. In totality, the meta-reasoning process will involve notion of self that controls its reasoning choices, monitors the products, and finally synergizes the self with the social context. Fig 2. Depicting the three levels involved in meta-reasoning. 5.6 Artificial Intelligence, AI. The field entails the study and design of intelligent agents or developing human-like intelligence in machines and software. John McCarthy, 1955, coined the term and referred to it as the object level, perception, reasoning level, monitoring, meta-reasoning level, control. Psychology paper number 1, Cognitive Science. Science and engineering of making intelligent machines. Since the time of inception itself, AI researchers have been questing to develop self-knowledge and introspection capacities in machines. Two prime views by Minsky, 1968, and McCarthy, 1968, prevailed to exchange views on the same. Minsky contended that for a machine to be intelligent enough to reciprocate on the questions of the world in itself, it should have an executable model of own self. On the other hand, McCarthy presented that for a machine to be intelligent, it must adequately declare its knowledge of the world and of itself. The former proposition was procedural in nature, whereas the latter was declarative. Minsky's view was found to be more logical, as it established relation between the knowledge of the world and agent's knowledge of itself in the world. He also correlates the knowledge of one's own knowledge of the world, or the metaknowledge, and one's own knowledge of own self and behavior, called the metacognitive knowledge. Nonetheless, both the views have been directed towards making machines intelligent enough so as to reflect and regulate the knowledge of its own self. 6. Assessment of metacognition. Metacognition, being a complex mental process encompassing series of cognitive phenomena, perhaps poses challenge in its evaluation. However, various techniques ranging from behavioral, psychometric to neuropsychological have been used. Each of the techniques is surfaced with merits and demerits, suggesting no perfect technique but rather an eclectic approach of assessment depending upon the component measured. For instance, questionnaires Pint, Rich, and DeGrout, 1990, Thomas, 2003, could be used to analyze the large group at once but may not yield true responses. Similarly, interviews Zimmerman and Martinez-Pons, 1990, could have the benefit of personal interaction and understanding of body language, but then it may not be time effective and prone to socially desirable responses. Another method of assessment which entails analysis of thinking aloud protocols Afflerbach, 2000, Beanman, Elshout Groen, 1993 could be an intrusive method yet subject to investigators' bias. Neuropsychological measure of eye movement analysis could yield reliable results but lose on cost effectiveness. Looking at the variation in the assessment process, it is important to first identify which metacognitive component to be gauged and then select suitable assessment measure ensuring least discrepancy amongst the scores and the task performance. With the advent of technology, another vital discretion is to choose among the offline or the online methods of assessment. The offline method offers pre- and post-assessment of the task whereas online method reflects assessment during the task performance. The recent trend favors online assessment as it reflects higher predictive value and the eases the process of assessment with a huge interface. Benman, 2005. The bottom line in any process of assessment is to have the investigated goal clear and preferably apply multimodal method of evaluation. 7. Application of metacognitive models to other fields. 7.1 Social psychology. Recent developments in social psychology can be traced to the parallel intensification of cognitive and metacognitive field. Social perception and social cognition deals with identification, interpretation, analysis of others' behavior in social situations. The mental processes of attribution, impression formation, and cognitive fallacies of understanding an individual in social context entail the role of cognition in social world. The information. Psychology paper number 1, Cognitive Science. Processing approach applied to understanding of social behavior such as aggression or conflict establishes itself with application of cognitive model in the social context. Metacognition in social domain may reflect in the ability to critically evaluate the social influences and relationships. The bird's eye view of the perception of social world and the ability to regulate social behavior assimilates the field of social psychology with metacognition. 7.2 Abnormal psychology. Sourcing its origin from the cognitive revolution, the role of metacognitive psychology has been increasingly identified in diagnosis and treatment of the psychological disorders. Woven in the cognitive fabric, metacognition in the clinical field focuses on the awareness of the cognitive set detached from self and perceived as mental phenomena. Growing body of literature recognizing cognitive deficits such as attention, memory, visuomotor activity, planning, decision-making etc. in psychopathology such as depression, schizophrenia. The unawareness and irregulation of such has fortified metacognitive roots in causation of such disorders. The use of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy in treatment of psychopathology fundamentally relies on the appreciation of metacognitive processes. Reduced metacognitive ability has related to greater vulnerability to psychopathology, especially depression. Moore et al., 2002. Treatment based on metacognitive training focuses on bringing the cognitive biases and distortions at the forefront of consciousness, perhaps challenge psychosis. In case of learning disabilities, use of metacognitive strategies in enhancing learning and problem-solving skills has also been suggested. 7.3 Educational psychology. Evidence of metacognitive concepts in the field of education has been reflected in concepts such as metacognitive knowledge, division and organization of knowledge, etc. Also, designing of educational pedagogy based on the cognitive development, its appraisal has gained newsworthy maturity. The influence of cognitive growth and experiential feedback in education is well reflected in recent pedagogy of computer-based cognitive tutoring, programmed learning, etc. The idea of cognitive economy and metacognitive experiences has also been nevertheless absorbed by educationists to internalize the notion of cognitive capacity and functioning in learning. The research in the areas of learning, metamemory, meta-reasoning has recently moved a step ahead from the labs to the school settings. The idea of translational educational science, where changes in education modalities resulting from research in the same and allied areas such as cognitive psychology and metacognition has been a contemporary breakthrough from pedagogical rigidity. Roediger, 2013. Recent trends have focused on metacognitive instructions to be embodied in teaching pedagogy for acquisition of metacognitive skills at an early age only. 7.4 Developmental psychology. Many of the developmental theories base their course on cognitive maturity. The landmarking conventional theories such as Piaget's cognitive development and Vygotsky moral development have viewed physical development in the context of cognitive growth. The cognitive transitions characterize the developmental milestones and also establish norms to verify any cognitive delay. Social interactions are believed to depict an important influence on the development of metacognitive process. Interpsychological development marks as the precursor for intrapsychological development. Initially, the significant others lead as proactive guide to the child. Later, the child becomes active and the parents invigilate and correct the child behavior. Psychology paper number 1, Cognitive Science. Finally, the child takes the lead and the parents emerge as supportive and sympathetic spectators. Brown and French. 1983. The theory of mind has also reflected the influence as the ability of the child to understand, own, and cognition of others. The chronological sequence with Tom has been an expression of metacognitive development in a child. The development of a child in terms of appraisal and regulation, information processing, perceptual skills, learning, conservation, etc. marks the dawn of metacognitive skills. 7.5 Cognitive neuroscience. The term cognitive neuroscience was first suggested by George Miller and Michael Gazzanga in late 1970s. The field entails understanding of biological underpinnings of cognitive faculties and its self-regulation. It attempts to assess the role of brain in regulation of cognitive and metacognitive functions. The domain exhibits to explain cognitive science with evidences from neuropsychology. It portrays cognitive model viewed in light of neuroscience and computational modeling. It stands as an interaction between neuroscience and cognitive science. It attempts to explore the neurobiological roots of metacognitive functions. Metacognitive neuroscientists use various imaging methods such as fMRI, EEG, PET scan to infer about the cognitive performance. Recent trends have focused research on specific minute areas of brain to unravel the related cognizance and second-order thinking. 8.